Well, hi everyone, this is Dean Woodbeck from Internet 2 and InCommon, and thank you for joining us today for our Baseline Expectations webinar. This will be the first of 3 such webinars over the next couple of months. The speakers today are Brett Bieber, who manages the Identity Access Management programming at the University of Nebraska, and Tom Barton, who is a Senior Consultant for Cybersecurity and Data Privacy at the University of Chicago, and also works with Internet 2 on research engagement, and Ann West, who is the Associate Vice President for Trust and Identity at Internet 2. And those are our speakers for today, and I will turn it right over to Brett. I should also mention Brett is the chair of the what was formerly known as the Assurance Advisory Committee, but which is now the Community Trust and Assurance Board, which is the group that has been working for over a year now on developing these baseline expectations. So Brett, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Dean, for the introduction. Also, thanks to Tom and Ann for joining me today to talk about baseline expectations. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. I also wanted to see if I could turn my camera on here. There was a conversation that we had a while ago, and I think Tom was the one who suggested that baseline expectations have a face. So I guess that's my face today. So you all get a chance to just see who's talking to you. But thanks everyone for joining us today, and I'll see if I can shut my camera off now so we can continue without that.
And there is the literal face of baseline expectations.
Great.
That was Tom speaking.
Yeah.
Suzanne West, back to you, Brett.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. And also thanks to all of you for joining us today. We've been talking about baseline expectations for quite a long time. I think Dean mentioned that the Assurance Advisory Committee now is the Community Trust and Assurance Board. And we've been working on this for a long time. And many of you may have seen some of the materials that we're going to present today, especially if you've participated in the assurance calls that we've had within InCommon. But some other material will be new. And also, I think we're really beginning to have a comprehensive understanding of what baseline will mean, and we're really ramping up the rollout of this as we prepare for the legal changes and the participation agreement changes that will be coming in a few months. So with that, I just want to start, and Dean mentioned that we have a few more webinars coming. This is a 3-part series. The first one that we've got today, which is on the impact for baseline expectations and what you can expect. The next one will be February 21st, and we'll be talking about metadata health checks with Nick Roy. And the third one, that will be with myself and Ann West, talking about policy aspects and legal changes that will come along with baseline expectations. So thank you, Dean, for sending out the notices about those, but I also just wanted to mention them here so you all can add them to your calendar. They'll be at the same time as this one, and please feel free to join us. I also wanted to mention, jump in, ask questions in the chat. That would be great. Feel free to just ask us any questions you have throughout the presentation. So the first thing I wanted to mention is we got a little agenda here. My wife likes to tell me that this is the learning before you learn, so just a couple of topics that we'll be covering today. We have basically 3 sections in this. What is this about? What is baseline expectations about? Then what's in it for me if I'm an identity provider, operator, a service provider? What is in it for me as one of those parties in our federation, as well as some end user answers to that question, what's in it for me? And then the last section will be, what do I need to do? And that will lead into a lot of the things that, hopefully a little checklist for some of you to begin thinking about your InCommon entities and where you're at in compliance with baseline expectations. So that's what we plan to cover today. So for the first part here, what is this about? This is a photo of Tom Barton dressed as a referee and myself taken at Tech Exchange last fall. Tom, he hosted a panel session where we had 2 competing sides. On one side, we had the identity provider operators holding on to the attributes and protecting their user privacy. And then on the other side, we had our service providers, which were trying to bring people together for collaboration, and they needed the attributes to accomplish their goals. And so Tom was a referee between the two sides there. It was sort of a tongue-in-cheek discussion between two sparring parties, the identity provider operators and service providers. And actually, it was one of my favorite sessions at Tech Exchange. I really enjoyed it. But I think it kind of set up some of the context about the conversations we've been having and where assurance has gone over the last few years. It really was about two competing sides. And looking at that from different perspectives can give us a little bit of information about why baseline expectations came about. So I was thinking about these two competing sides, you know, and here I've got an image of just the scales of justice here, and support and opposition, where you could weigh a couple of different sides of our federation here. On one side, we might have our identity providers, and then on the other side, we might have our service providers. And what I was thinking about was our baseline expectations, how they are different from what we've had in the past. The levels of assurance, which you all are probably familiar with, InCommon's bronze and silver profiles, identified a long checklist of items that an IDP operator would have to comply with in order to assert that level of assurance. And those profiles were aligned with NIST's 863-2, levels of assurance 1 and 2. And it was a significant amount of work. We didn't have very many identity provider operators that actually met those specifications. I think we had 1 for silver, and then we have 6 in bronze, but it's quite a significant amount of work to go through and assert your compliance with all of those individual items. That isn't to say that they're not valuable, but the balance of workload was entirely on the identity provider operators. On the other side, with service providers, you could say that the service providers were accepting all of the risk because they had to accept any of the identities that an IDP would assert. And so looking at this from two perspectives can sort of help give a little bit of context here about what we're talking about. If you're looking at it from the service provider perspective, you may think that the risk outweighs the amount of work that the IDP operators had to go through. But thinking back to, you know, that referee moment between the IDP operators and the service providers, I think that that's the historical way where we've thought about assurance, and the tools that we had in the past for elevating trust in our federation was the levels of assurance, and that the IDP operators had to perform all of the work. Now, I don't want to say that bronze and silver don't have value. They certainly do. There's a lot of value that they bring in the assessment of your identity and access management program. But I don't know that the bronze and silver strike that right balance between the work required and the risk the level of assurance was to mitigate on the end of the service providers. So this actually sets up some of that conflict that Tom had to act as the referee between. So the difference here with what we have in the past and baseline expectations adds requirements for all of these parties. It has requirements or guidance. I guess Tom can help me on my correct wording here, because we don't want to say things like compliance. But there are expectations for every party here. Identity providers have expectations, service providers have expectations, and the federation operator also has expectations. The goal here is that we want to increase the trust in one another and improve that user experience to bring the added value and the ease of interoperability within the federation. So this helps a little bit of context setting for why baseline expectations is slightly different than what we've done in the past in levels of assurance, and where we're trying to go with baseline expectations. So really, what are these baseline expectations? I've got 3 slides upcoming, and each of them separated out by the different parties that I mentioned before. The first is the identity provider operator baseline expectations. And there's just 4 simple requirements, and these are meant to be really high-level statements of the expectations of an IDP operator in the Federation. The first one is that the IDP is operated with organizational level authority. I think really what that's getting at is that we don't want an individual department running the infrastructure that represents an entire institution. The second one here, the IDP is trusted enough to be used to access the organization's own systems. That also gets at the criticality of this infrastructure, and that it needs to be important enough to the institution that it should be trusted to use to access their own systems. This is some of the eat your own dog food expectation there. The third one, generally accepted security practices are applied to the IDP. This one is intended to be a high-level statement. I think we found in the past when you get down to really specific requirements about security, and security is such a fast-paced changing field, that we can come into conflict between trying to meet compliance with a specific set of security recommendations. So at a high level, we just wanted to say generally accepted security practices are applied to the IDP. And then the fourth one, this gets down to some of the specific items that we can check. Federation metadata is accurate, complete, and includes site technical, admin, security contacts, metadata UI information, and a privacy policy URL. And that's simply it. That's the 4 expectations for an identity provider operator. The second one that we have here is for our service providers. Service providers have controls in place to reasonably secure information and maintain user privacy. And as it kind of relates to GDPR, I think there are a couple of instances here where you could tie in some expectations about GDPR and how there are connections here to the importance of that, specifically with service providers and whether or not they share information with other parties. The first one kind of hits at that. The second expectation, information received from IDPs is not shared with third parties without permission and is stored only when necessary for SP's purpose. The third item here, generally accepted security practices are applied to the SP. This is the same language that was expected of the IDP at that very high level, generally accepted security practices. The fourth one, the same requirement from the IDP side. Federation metadata is accurate, complete, and includes site technical, admin, security contacts, metadata UI information, and privacy policy URL. And then the fifth one here, this kind of relates to some user experience that we've had issues with. Unless governed by an applicable contract, attributes required to obtain service are appropriate and made known publicly. So those are the 5 expectations for our service providers. The third one here, and I mentioned that there's another party here, and Tom was acting as the referee at that Tech Exchange session. But there is a third party that we have within our federation that can help with our trust, and that is the federation operator. For us, that would be InCommon. And there are 5 expectations for the federation operator. The first, focus on the trustworthiness of their federation as a primary objective and be transparent about such efforts. Number 2, generally accepted security practices are applied to the federation's operational systems, same expectation as the IDP operators and SP operators. Number 3, good practices are followed to ensure accuracy and authenticity of metadata to enable secure and trustworthy federated transactions. And that is a pretty high-level statement there. We can talk about some of those details a little bit later, or it would be interesting to hear some of that as well. The fourth one here, frameworks that improve trustworthy use of federation, such as entity categories, are implemented and adoption by members is promoted. Entity categories might include research and scholarship support, as well as multi-factor interoperability. Those are other frameworks that enhance the trustworthy use of federation. And then the last one here, number 5, work with relevant federation operators to promote the realization of baseline expectations. We are in this global world here, and I'm sure you all know with EduGain, identities can be shared across the entire globe, services are shared across the entire globe, And we have a number of Federation operators that help support that infrastructure and that trust fabric between us all. And baseline expectations doesn't have to end at InCommon's borders. This should be something that we should push for and work with our partners in the other research and education federations so that they have similar expectations of their members for IDPs, service providers, as well as their Federation operations. So those are our baseline expectations, and those were approved by InCommon Steering right at the end of 2016. The legal requirement hasn't been made yet. The baseline expectations, while InCommon Steering has approved them, they're not legal and part of the participation agreement for all members yet. So that's why we've been talking about this, and it's taken us quite a while to get everything in place to make sure that baseline expectations will be successful. And they will eventually be incorporated into the participation agreement, which, as I mentioned, that's our third webinar coming up in March. And Ann West will be talking a little bit about that. But until that actually hits the legal requirement, we've been building all of this and working with the Assurance Advisory Committee, now the Community Trust and Assurance Board, to identify some of the details and some of the challenges with baseline expectations. And this line here just sort of acknowledges that some of those requirements are really clear, and some of them are a little bit blurry, or you can't quite tell exactly what they mean. And I think that was intentional. And let's talk a little bit about what that means for us. So some of those items that are very clear, and I think another important thing to mention here with baseline expectations is that we are looking at these expectations through the community's eyes. We're looking at these expectations through your eyes. We're using the community to help guide the vision around this. There are some requirements that are very clear, and for example, this is one that is pretty clear. The Federation metadata includes site technical, admin, and security context, metadata UI information, and privacy policy URL. Much of that can be automated, and that will be what Nick Roy is going to be talking about at our second webinar, is how InCommon Operations is helping realize baseline expectations by developing some tools that will automatically check for these items that are really clear and can help the Federation elevate the metadata that we have and all of our entities in the Federation so that the user experience is met and we have a really great user experience. On the other side, some of these expectations are a little bit more hard to focus in on. For example, generally accepted security practices are applied to the IDP. That's one where we are not spelling out exactly how quickly you need to patch if there's a critical vulnerability. We don't get down into that lower level of security requirements. So really, how do we interpret that as a community? Another one that's a little more difficult to take a look at is good practices are followed to ensure accuracy and authenticity of metadata. And this is one of the Federation operator requirements. And the third one is privacy policy. We don't say what your privacy policy has to be, just that you have one. So some of these we'll have to think through and sharpen our focus together as we understand what these expectations are. So related to that, I think one of the key things, and Tom, feel free to jump in here if you have a moment and you want to add a little bit of context.
I have a moment, Brett. I kind of have assigned this period of time for moments like this, I guess. So I'm happy to jump in for a second. You know, and this does kind of remind me a lot of that refereed session at the last technology exchange. Because generally speaking, people, you know, the choices they make are usually reasonable from their perspective. And we kind of want to rely on that, you know, innate principle. This is sort of from within. So when you think about, well, what's generally accepted? I know some of us are in the habit of wanting an outside external authority to tell us precisely, like in terms of bronze and silver, what is the checklist? Just tell me what I have to do. I want to check everything off my checklist. And really what we want, that's sufficient but not necessary to engender the level of trust and manage the risk that we need to manage in the R&E Federation space within InCommon. Another approach is to have confidence that people are applying the same kind of diligence and care to their federated entities, their IDPs and SPs on their campuses, as they do to other things in their IT infrastructure that they care about. So if you want to know what the checklist is, for example, about what's generally accepted security practices for your IDP or your SP, probably the best place to talk is with your security people, your own security people. You don't necessarily have to come up with, bronze next generation at a community level as an external specification we all must meet. That would be one way, but isn't the only way. And then if you don't have security people, or if they don't give you answers that you like, or if you have some ambiguity or confusion, I think it's great to use the InCommon community. These expectations are, as Brett has explained, are a product of extended discussion across the InCommon community. And what's new, as Brett is starting to show us, about the processes like for the feedback on the health check information, about the metadata quality, but also other processes that I think Brett's going to get into in a minute here, that are new to the InCommon community that can be used to help address, questions like this. When you're unsure what to do, well, Brett's going to start telling you what you can do about that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So a lot of these items that there is some ambiguity, or also in case someone has a concern, the other items that we've been working on within the Community Trust and Assurance Board is, what's my course of action if I have a concern? What happens, since this is just our first version here, this doesn't have to be the end point. We intend to elevate our baseline for our own community over time. So what will that process look like? The Community Trust and Assurance Board has finalized their new charter. I think Dean mentioned, and I mentioned before, that the Assurance Advisory Committee has now been adjusted. The charter has been changed, and we are now the Community Trust and Assurance Board, and we will be focused not only on the InCommon Assurance Program, but also on supporting baseline expectations. And we've been working through those processes that will help the community achieve consensus, handle disputes between different parties, and also continue to develop our baseline expectations. Inside the slides, and I think we can provide a link to them, or Dean, I don't know if you have them available. There are a few links in case you want to actually read the CTAB charter, or if you want to read through the baseline expectations document as published, and also some of these processes that we have worked through. Feel free to take a look at some of those and read through them. The first one that I mentioned here, continue to develop baseline expectations. We know that this is not our end state. We're going to continue to develop baseline expectations, and the Community Trust and Assurance Board will help the community continue to develop baseline expectations to add additional requirements or help refine and give that focus to individual items. The consensus process is a process by which we will try and utilize the community's expertise to help develop our standards for baseline expectations. The consensus process, as outlined by the link at the bottom here, processes to maintain baseline expectations by InCommon and its members, allows us to answer that question about a specific scenario. And one of those scenarios may be, is it okay to be running Shibboleth Identity Provider version 2? That may be a question that comes up and that the Community Trust and Assurance Board will have to give some explicit guidance on. And we have a consensus process that will allow us to arrive as a community at that final decision, publish those recommendations provisionally, and then get that approved and then incorporate it into baseline expectations, or spin off other working groups to develop a profile that answers that question. there's a number of different outcomes that can come out of that consensus process.
So Brett, can I jump in here for a second?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to point out a couple of high-level things that is kind of going on in baseline expectations. One of them is really, and I think Brett hit it right on the nail, right on the head of the nail, rather, is really what we're looking at is elevating trust over time in the Federation. So the CTAB is really instituting with InCommon operations support a change management process across the Federation. It also is going to shine the light on all of everyone's metadata, for instance, and making sure that, as you noticed I put in the chat, all those typos are fixed, and all of the administrative contacts that maybe you haven't touched in a couple of years and the folks have left, getting those up to date. So it's really going to help get that data refreshed so that you can connect with folks if there's an issue. So the second thing is, so it's change management. The second thing is, and I think Tom talked a little bit about this, is you'll see a requirement for security contacts. InCommon, you'll also start seeing in separate emails things about being collaboration ready and a new security incident response framework called Certify, that if you're a site admin, you can log into the Federation Manager portal and actually check for your IDP or your SP that you support Certify, which is an international federated incident response trust framework that is being required by a number of different research organizations and projects now. So there's a relationship between the Federation site administrator and that whole function and security that's starting to be encouraged more. And that also comes out in those baseline expectations like Tom mentioned. So I just want to point out those two things, a relationship with security as well as a change management function that's you're going to hear more about this, right, over time.
Great. Thanks, Ann. The one item I did want to talk a little bit more about was the dispute resolution process. And that is a well-defined process that will allow a participant, a member of our community, to express a concern about another participant and then have the support of the Community Trust and Assurance Board as well as InCommon Steering to arrive at some acceptable resolution. And the resolution may be that a participant that is offending and not in compliance with baseline expectations is removed from the Federation as an end result of that. There's a defined process so that we can help settle disputes and coordinate between parties that have concerns how to achieve a consensus and a resolution to that concern. And then the last item here, which Nick has been placing some information in the chat about, is that for those items that are verifiable and can be automatically verified, InCommon Operations is going to begin automatically monitoring those items and then be able to provide a report of whether or not those automatically verifiable items are in compliance with baseline expectations or need some help. And I know that things over time can sort of fall down. I know within our own department, Central IT changed its name, so the website changed, and our links for our error URLs or privacy policies may have changed. All of that stuff just sort of happens over time. And this automated monitoring is really going to help us ensure that our Federation metadata is kept up to date and as accurate as it can be.
And Brett, I wonder if I could kind of jump in here and amplify some of what you've just been going over, and Ann too, to some extent. You know, it's normal and essential, in part, to think about baseline expectations in terms of those statements, some that are clear and some that are blurry. That sort of is where the bar is being set, and that might continue to rise slowly over time, as Ann was talking about. But it's also a dynamic thing. It's these new processes. The InCommon Federation has never had a process, a routine way of providing that kind of feedback about the quality of entity metadata to site admins, for example, that Brett was just talking about. We've never had, other than an ad hoc way of managing disputes, we're not going to have a regular process that we can repeatedly follow that's all about, discovery and getting people to communicate and shedding light on whatever a matter may be, and trying to find a way of having a happy resolution before, the teeth need to be sunk in after all that, effort's been expended. And also for having consensus processes, not just someone throw a question out on an email list and see what comes out of the email thread. I think we're going to try to do quite a bit better than that in terms of what the rules of the road are going to be in terms of making sure that all of the different kinds of voices that should be heard by the, representing the community's interests in a given proposition are heard, that kind of thing. So these are all new, and from my perspective, I rather expect and hope, and I'm kind of excited by what kind of value having these kinds of processes added to the Federation will bring. I hope a lot. Thanks, Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think another aspect that you kind of hinted at there was representation. And that was one thing that we really wanted to focus on in the CTAB charter, was how do we get a board that is representative of all of InCommon, and including large R1 institutions, smaller liberal arts colleges, commercial service providers, and virtual organizations that operate service providers. How do we get enough representation within that board, and also within our community consensus process, the ability to call in specific experts in an area so that we can have results of consensus and also dispute resolution that represents our entire community. So as Tom mentioned, I'm really excited about what this will bring to InCommon and what this will bring to our member participants so that they have courses of action and that we can get some clarity on some of these questions. So the next item, the next area of the presentation is really what's in it for me. If I'm an identity provider operator, if I'm a service provider, or if I'm an end user, what will be some of the benefits that Baseline Expectations will bring for me? The first one that we're going to talk about is identity provider operators. And Baseline Expectations will allow you to remove an obstacle to your faculty, students, and staff and allow them to have this friction-free access to federated resources. I know that this has been a challenge for a number of virtual organizations, just allowing them to have that infrastructure so that they can access all of the services. Following Baseline Expectations will allow all of that access to happen in a more friction-free way. When URLs are broken, that causes friction. When error URLs don't show up properly, when contact information isn't accurate and someone needs to reach out to someone to help modify something within your identity provider or your service provider. When that contact information isn't accurate, that brings friction to our constituents accessing those services. Baseline Expectations will help improve your service as an identity provider operator. The second item here, simplifying the onboarding of services, I think this is an aspect that really speaks to the work that we do as identity provider operators. And speaking just from my experience at the University of Nebraska, it's a challenge to do the metadata exchange. Having people and services that are members of our federation, we know it greatly simplifies the access if we can automatically ingest their service provider metadata. The added benefits of Baseline Expectations will allow us to eliminate some of those concerns. In particular, let's say we have a service provider that wants to interoperate with us. We always have these perennial questions about privacy and what will this service provider be doing with those attributes that we release. I will know if the service provider is a member of InCommon, that they will be in compliance with Baseline Expectations, and they'll be treating those attributes appropriately and keep them private. So I'm hoping that for identity provider operators, Baseline Expectations will really simplify and bring a lot more value to utilizing the Federation as that vehicle for exchanging metadata. The next category is service providers. So what's in it for me? A better user experience. And this is something that we've heard a lot of from those virtual organizations that want to create like a discovery, IDP discovery page that allows the user to find their own home institution. If the home institution is spelled incorrectly, or if it's not, doesn't have a logo that's immediately recognizable, those sorts of things impact the ability for the users to get into your service. Baseline expectations will improve upon all of those attributes and make them, all those metadata attributes, and make them more valuable to create a better user experience. The second item here relates to what I mentioned before about identity provider operators. If you're a service provider and you have these questions about getting attributes, asserting those attributes and making those attributes that are required for your service known will eliminate some of the challenges with releasing those attributes from IDPs. If I'm from a VO, this will greatly enhance the quality of your IDPs that are available to you. Accurate contacts, including a security contact, which we know is becoming very important. And the last item here, if you're a commercial service provider, answering those just perennial concerns. What are you doing with the attributes? Do you have a privacy policy? By being a member of the Federation and being in compliance with baseline expectations, you will have fewer questions, and you'll also have resources that you can point a concerned identity provider to about how you treat those attributes, what your privacy policy is.
Brett, this is Ann again. The other actual value proposition that I've heard from a couple of service providers, and this is really in the library space, is that they have seen issues with configurations, for instance, of existing proxies, and have had historically some issues with that. The thing that they like about this is that they're not always sure who to contact when they move to a SAML-based access approach. They're still not always sure who to access, who to talk to about security-related issues. And so having these contacts in the metadata is something that's of great interest to them. They actually have someone with that in mind that's available to them.
Yeah, that's a great use case, Ann. Hopefully that will be an improvement for them. The last item that I want to mention here for end users, what is the benefit? I think we've touched on a lot of these. We're hoping that we will improve the user experience. And this is something that we've heard from folks like Scott Coranda and Jim Basney. And end users, they can get frustrated when they're trying to access a service and they can't. We're hoping that with baseline expectations, it will reduce the amount of bumps that people experience as trying to access a service. It's also going to be clearer what to do, to Ann's point about knowing who to contact. Having accurate contact information is going to improve upon that. Also, now that we know we will have all of these basic required elements for the metadata user interface information, it will be a much better foundation to build services and user interfaces on top of for things like discovery and all of those other interfaces that can utilize the metadata underneath it, including eventually consent and attribute release, pulling from some of the metadata to know what is a service provider asking for and having a privacy policy available so that you could link to that and allow the user to read a little bit more about how the SP intends to treat your information. So there's a lot of benefits here for all of these parties, identity provider operators, service providers, as well as end users. So now we get sort of to the last part of the presentation here. What really do I need to do to comply with all of these expectations? And we've come up with a series of action items that I'd recommend each participant begin to think about. Begin thinking about the baseline expectations for your entities. If you are a member of the Federation, you can enter in an IDP as well as a number of service providers. For each of those, you need it would be good to go through and answer the question about meeting baseline expectations. The first one there, is your IDP trusted enough to be used with your own internal systems? I think that one is something that we should be easy to answer, and if not, then we'll know that you have work to do. As Tom mentioned before, have a conversation with your security team about their recommended security practices for critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure like your student information system or your HR systems. What security practices would they recommend for that type of infrastructure?
Or for their other authentication systems that are used around the campus.
Yeah, absolutely.
LDAP or Active Directory or whatever it may be. This is more of the same.
The last item here, make sure that you have the right people. The technical and strategy policy leaders are on InCommon's lists. InCommon will begin communicating a lot more regularly about baseline expectations, and having the right people represented there is going to be important. Make sure that you're listening and aware of what's going on and the communication that's coming out. You can also update the contacts within the Federation Manager for your metadata contacts, but there are other contacts that aren't included in the metadata, and it's important to make sure that those folks are on the list that represent them. And InCommon does a great job of validating when a site admin contact needs to be updated. So make sure that your exec knows that process and can get the correct site admins added for your entities in the Federation. And join those lists that are available where we'll be sharing communications about baseline expectations.
Yeah, Brett, I'd like to kind of add to that too. I tried to emphasize earlier a moment ago about one of the things that's really new about all this are the processes that InCommon is implementing for the first time. And those processes are all about engaging with people at participant sites. It's not InCommon talking to itself. And it's all about really having the right people at all the participants kind of paying attention as appropriate. Site admins have a specific role, as you were saying, with regard to the metadata and that the health check feedback loop that's being implemented. Some of the questions that we've seen in the chat and that have arisen here in the discussion are also technical like that, but many of them are going to be more strategic or policy level, and we really would like to ensure that folks at your campuses and organizations that, the technical folks take such questions to are also appropriately tuned in. So we want to have them be in the loop somehow. So really, when we say please make sure the right people are on the lists, I wanted to kind of flesh that out a bit. It's really both the technical and at the strategic and policy level. It's going to be quite important to make sure that we have our consensus decisions reflect the input of the right kinds of people from participants.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tom. And also, as it relates to our community consensus process and dispute resolution, within those processes, there is an opportunity to impanel participants from the community to help us answer some of those questions. And so we may be reaching out to our community for an expert in security to answer a specific question or concern that comes up within a dispute. Having those contacts within our metadata and also available on those lists will help us identify members in our community that can help reach consensus or answer questions about a concern or arrive at a consensus decision. So that's another area where having accurate contact information is going to be helpful for us as we begin to answer some of these questions about baseline expectations. So in addition to these action items that I would recommend, there also are a few of those metadata checks which we'll be talking in depth about in our next webinar. Do you have all of these contacts listed within your metadata? And this is for all of your IDPs and SPs that are in the Federation. Do you have a name? Do you have a description? Do you have a logo for every single entity in there? Have you established what your privacy policy would be? And I know David Vance had done a survey, and he had sent out a summary of his findings to the list. I think it was the InCommon participants list regarding privacy policy URLs and what people are using for them. That might be a great resource if you want to look at other entities and what they are using for their privacy policy. But it would be good to begin thinking about what do you need, what gaps do you have, do you need to develop a privacy policy? And I think on our third webinar, Anne will be mentioning a little bit more about this, these questions about policies and answering those types of questions. But it would be good to take an inventory of all your service providers and see if they have a privacy policy or if you need to develop one. The last item here, error URL. Right now that is recommended. It's not included in our baseline expectations as a requirement, but we expect to include that one in our next version of baseline expectations. So as we continue to push that baseline, we'll be adding in specific items, and the error URL is one that is already on our list to add for version 2. But it would be good to include that right now. Take a look and see if you have an error URL included in your entities, and make sure that you add one if you don't have one. The places where that error URL can be very useful is if there is a problem with logging in or there's a missing information, where can the SP direct the user to? Can they get an answer or guidance to who they should talk to on their campus? I know there's been a lot of concern about the connections between the folks that run the identity provider operators and the researchers or faculty, staff, and students who need to log into a service. So error URLs and having one of those within the metadata helps bridge that connection, that gap between the users that we may not get to interact with on a regular basis and the operators of those services or the identity providers, so that we can put the people in contact with someone that can really help them. So that's a set of checklist items that are good to begin looking at. And I wanted to mention also, Anne had introduced this before, but baseline is not, it's not the top, it's not the highest level here. This is our minimum or our lowest set of requirements. There are a lot of other profiles and other frameworks which you can use to expand or go beyond what we have within baseline. The first one here, research and scholarship support. I know there's a number of institutions that jumped in early and were supporters of research and scholarship within InCommon. And just so you know a little bit more information about that, that is a entity category for a service provider so that they can identify themselves as supporting research and scholarly activities. And the intent there is to give identity providers a way to signal that this is intended for research and scholarship activity, have greater confidence that you can release the attributes to it because a user is trying to, the purpose of that SP is to support research and scholarship. So we had many IDPs that announced their initial support for that within InCommon. That framework and that entity category has moved on to the entire Research and Education Federation. So there's a new REFEDS category for research and scholarship, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. Make sure that your identity provider is on the list of those IDPs that are supporting research and scholarship for the REFEDS version through all of the federations. The second item here is Security Incident Response Trust Framework for Federated Identity, Certify. That's a great framework for announcing that you will support and you will have a security contact available if an incident occurs and you would like to know about it. So that framework is a very useful tool for service providers as well as identity providers to provide a little bit of information about their security contacts and publicly announce that you are interested in being notified about security incidents that may relate to either your users or the services your users are accessing. The last one here, this was a working group that was spun off from the Assurance Advisory Committee and InCommon Steering, the multi-factor authentication interoperability profile. That's another way that you can increase trust between your IDP and a service provider, a way for you to express that multi-factor authentication has occurred for the individual identity that had just logged in. So these are all various ways in which you can go above and beyond baseline, and I would encourage everyone to take a look at all those different opportunities to expand and really elevate those trust levels between your partners, between the identity providers and service providers. I don't know, Ann or Tom, is there anything that you all want to add on those three items there?
I would just like to add that you know, this is, like you mentioned, this is ready to collaborate. So the National Science Foundation recently released a solicitation for Campus Cyber Infrastructure Awards. And in that proposal submission process, organizations need to submit and develop and submit a cyber infrastructure plan. And as part of that, NSF asks for information about how you support InCommon. Do you have an identity provider in InCommon? Does it support global research and scholarship? Because that's important in the research side of things, obviously, to enable and reduce that friction. It further reduces the friction that Brett was talking about. But then it also, they asked for from baseline. And I would add a third of certify, which is, as I mentioned earlier, something that's being required by a number of research organizations. I think I want to, though, at the end, underscore that this is not just for science. This is academic collaboration. And there are other groups like the Modern Language Association that rely on this infrastructure just as much as science does. And so if you think, well, you know, we don't do a lot of research in our science side of things, you know, this isn't for me, this can support not only the scholarship in the humanities, but teaching and learning, as indicated by Melissa Wu in her webinar a couple weeks ago. Melissa's the CIO of Stony Brook and mentioned the amount of support that this whole infrastructure and the collaboration that it enables can bleed into many different areas, including teaching and learning. So just want to make sure that you understand this is not just for science.
Yeah, and then Tom, I wonder, would you mind mentioning a little bit about Certify? I know you've been involved from the beginning on the Certify framework. Is there any additional context you want to add there?
No, I think you hit the main point. It's actually not rocket science, you know. It's not a technological issue. What the issue is that, you know, in this federation where there's now thousands and soon becoming, or maybe probably beyond tens of thousands, I would say, of IPPs and SPs worldwide, that they can interact with each other now, and it keeps growing. We compare that, you know, ecosystem that has tens of thousands of interacting technical things to what our typical security teams or security response plans embrace, which is stuff that's contained within one campus, almost always, and maybe not even the whole campus. So it's not that people don't know how to deal with security incidents, it's that they're just really not used to hearing about them from farther afield than that. So what Certify really is about is saying, geez, one, publish your security contact information in Federation metadata, so that if someone else, say, notices that an account from your university seems to be involved in some kind of a, you know, unauthorized use of resources at a service provider, or if you happen to be at a university and you know an account was compromised and you happen to know that it was used to access some stuff at a site where people might actually care about it, you know, how to let them know. That's one. And 2 is just some very basic statements, very low bar about that amount to saying if someone does contact you, then you'll do what you can to coordinate the incident management with them, as because you're apparently a part of a piece of a larger incident, one that's spreading across several different organizations connected by federation. So Certify is just about that. It's the framework to kind of help engender the response to an incident in all the places where that response needs to be engendered.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So in summary, I would say that the key changes here from baseline expectations, if you thought that InCommon was just a metadata repository, baseline expectations is really going to turn the InCommon Federation into the most trusted resource for identities and collaborative services in academia. I think that's one of the most exciting points about baseline expectations, is that it will transform our federation from what it is today into something really much more valuable. There's a number of items that are still left, and this diagram that was built by Tom, it's a swim lane diagram of each of the different participants that play a role within baseline expectations and the baseline expectations rollout. So in the various colors here, we have the participants up top. We have the AAC, now known as the Community Trust and Assurance Board. We have InCommon Steering, and then we have InCommon Operations. Every single one of these small little beans is a separate and distinct activity that all relates to baseline expectations. And right now, we are in January 2018. We have a significant amount of work ahead of us, but we will continue to be engaged with the community about what's happening with baseline expectations. The next 2 webinars will be talking about that health checks and all of the works that InCommon Operations has been doing to operationalize baseline expectations. And then the participation agreement and other legal changes and all of that advice. We'll be talking about that and preparing to notify the community for the changes in the participation agreement. So this is just a roadmap, and feel free to take a look at that link if you want to read any more detail about each of the individual activities that we have there. The last item here, just another awareness bit about our upcoming webinars. Next will be metadata health checks on Wednesday, February 21st, and then after that, the policy and legal changes with Ann West on Wednesday, March 7th. And I know Nick is on. I don't know if he has, if he dialed in. Nick, I don't know if you have any previews for us, or if there's any additional information you want to share about people to get them attending in our next webinar.
I don't think Nick's on the phone. I know he's in the chat, and we'll be going through the various metadata elements and what we're doing to check those. And we'll also try and provide, if there are questions that you have about the actual implementation and expectations, send those along to me, awest@internet2.edu, and we'd be happy to answer those as much as we can in the upcoming webinar also, as well as throwing those into the FAQ. So Nick's going to go into a lot more detail about the metadata changes.
Yeah, I'm really excited for what Nick and the rest of the team has prepared, especially for what that's going to give a participant within InCommon the awareness of any easily identifiable problems or concerns with their metadata. So I'm really excited for that. Join us February 21st for that talk, as well as on March 7th for the policy and legal changes. And with that, thanks everyone for joining us today. And as Ann mentioned, feel free to reach out on the list. We are also CTAB, CTAB at incommon.org if you have any questions there, or feel free to send an email to any of us. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Dean?
Thanks, Brett. Great presentation, and thanks to Tom and Ann, too, and Nick also for chiming in a lot in the chat. And we hope to see most of you back here on February 21st. Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, folks.